The transfer portal has been open since Monday. A bunch of very talented players have gone in there. One of the big guys, one of the big names we want to talk about today is Dillon Thieneman. He's a safety out of Purdue, someone who, during the course of last season, we did a preview show for the Ohio State Purdue game, and Kevin Noon and I were talking about on the preview show, hey, Dillon Thieneman might be a name to watch for Ohio State in the transfer portal. Ryan Walters, the Purdue coach, was fired at the end of the season. Pretty much the entire Purdue team is in the portal now. Dillon Thieneman, definitely the most intriguing of the Purdue possibilities in the portal. Someone who's visiting Ohio State in the next week or so. Wanted to talk to Tony Gerdeman of Buckeye Huddle about Thieneman, the likelihood of Thieneman ending up a Buckeye next season, where he might fit, and much more. But Tony, I think the first thing to start with on this one is this might be something that's only happening because of a coaching change, because Thieneman is a Purdue legacy, and once Ryan Walters was fired, then it was like, okay, now he's going in the portal.
Yeah, I believe he's got two brothers that have also been safeties at Purdue, and it's like a long family lineage of players there. And I think I've told this story before of talking with PJ Fleck about players, and this was the Big Ten Media Days, and somebody asked him about Dillon Thieneman, and he's like, we were recruiting him, and I knew he was a Purdue legacy, and I said, Dillon, do we have a shot? Like, if I'm going to recruit you, I need to know I have a shot. And, he said he had a shot, so they recruited him. They fell short, and he ended up where everybody expected him to go. And, those who follow Ohio State and who cover Ohio State, nobody knew Dillon Thieneman was never on our radar until he opens up as a true freshman and goes out there and posts 106 tackles as the Big Ten freshman of the year, as a freshman All-American, as like a third team All-American. And you're like, oh. And then a couple weeks ago on the Buckeye Huddle message board, I posted like a Black Friday thread of like, all right, Black Friday's coming. Who would you like to see in the portal? Who would you go shopping for? And Dillon Thieneman was one of the two names I put in there. So am I responsible? Who's to say? You say it's Ryan Walters. We'll see.
Well, lots of credit potentially to go around here if the Buckeyes can end up adding Dillon Thieneman to their 2025 class. You mentioned his stats as a true freshman in 2023. He came back, no sophomore slump this year, over 100 tackles again this year for Purdue. A really, really solid second season. And, sometimes you have the guy who's a true freshman phenom and then, takes a little bit of a step back. We've seen that with some Buckeyes over the J.K. Dobbins, for example. Has had a fantastic freshman season, took a little bit of a step back, and then had an enormous third season. Dillon Thieneman, no problem. No freshman season, no problem. Just another solid 2024. And I think the next question we got to get to is, where would he fit on the Ohio State defense? Because you've potentially got Caleb Downs coming back, presumably have Caleb Downs coming back. Dillon Thieneman kind of plays that same free safety type spot. Where would you see Jim Knowles potentially, if the Buckeyes can add Thieneman, where would you see Jim Knowles maybe slotting the different safeties in together?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because the type of safety that Dillon Thieneman plays, if you guys have ever watched him, there are times he's lined up, he's a single high safety, and he's lined up 25 yards beyond, deep. And there are times he's not even in the picture, depending on how wide the camera is. And then he'll come crashing down, or he'll, go defend the pass. So that's not Ohio State's defense, or at least it isn't right now. And I wouldn't expect that it would be next year either, because that's a Ryan Walters thing. And so I wouldn't even think Dillon Thieneman's going to, if he returned to Purdue, would be doing that same thing. But I think they can do either. And Caleb Downs is great in the box, and Dillon Thieneman is used to being outside of the box and then coming, wherever else he needs to be, he can get there. So maybe that's one where you have Dillon Thieneman as your free safety and you move Caleb Downs to strong safety. Either way, you've got to replace Lathan Ransom. We know how they feel about Jalen McClain and Malik Hartford, but if they're already planning visits, then that also tells you how they feel about Dillon Thieneman. And really anybody in the Big Ten who has seen him, and he's being recruited by everybody. And right now, I think the two visits are Oregon and Ohio State. And Tom, once you say Oregon, then you have Ohio State fans who are like, you could have just told me that at the outset.
Well, the good news is Oregon has to be pretty much full with safeties, with all the other safeties they took away from Ohio State in recruiting this cycle. So presumably that room They may have to knock out a wall to add more space for all the safeties they're going after. But, you mentioned Malik Hartford, you mentioned Jalen McClain. I think that tells me a lot about if they're really pursuing Thieneman very aggressively. That tells me a lot about what they think about him, because we've heard them talk about Jalen McClain. We've seen Malik Hartford played as a true freshman some. He didn't play a whole heck of a lot this year because he was behind Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs, who were two pretty darn good safeties on their own. But, they have other guys in this room. This is not like they're desperate to fill a spot and they just need a body. The fact that if you're potentially going after someone like Thieneman with all the other guys in that room and with Downs presumably coming back next year, that tells me where they think he ranks among safeties and puts him probably pretty close to the top of the list.
Yeah, and it's also to the point where the numbers aren't great in terms of the overall numbers in the room. You're going to need to continue to improve those, and you'd rather improve them with starter level players that will raise everybody up. And if they were able to land him, they've shown they will play multiple players, and if anybody is capable of playing, they'll try to get them out there when they can. But the fact that they're going after him is interesting, and it gives you some insight into maybe the aggression that we're going to see with the portal this year, because they do want to just go with their recruits as much as possible, and they use the portal to offset things. Sometimes they're guys that are just too good to pass up, and maybe this is one of those instances, and it is much more a business than it has ever been before. So players kind of have to understand that, and they have the freedom to move if they don't like it. And you can't just assume everybody is going to be okay next year in terms of, we'll all develop. If you've got an opportunity to make your room better, you do it. And with the understanding of how does this impact the locker room? Because the guys they brought in this class, the 2024, have all been locker room additions. And I've never heard anything bad about Dillon Thieneman in that way. So, I wouldn't think he's some sort of a locker room poison either.
And, I think the guys in the locker room know how good people are, and they went against Thieneman this year. They spent a whole week watching film, I'm sure. So, it's not a mystery that he is a good player. If we were talking about it before the game, I would assume that that's something that came up in the locker room as well. Buckeyes added 3 safeties in the 2025 recruiting class. Fahim Delane, who is like a top 60 kind of player nationally, plus Deshaun Stewart and Cody Haddad. So they kind of reloaded that room to a certain degree. Those are not guys who you're necessarily expecting to contribute this year. And Thieneman could potentially be a 1 year and out guy if he heads to the NFL. The other piece of this is you don't talk about this really yet. We haven't really talked about any of this yet, but everyone is on basically a 1 year deal in the college football world right now. There's no guarantee that any individual player, no matter how good a season he had at Ohio State this year, is guaranteed to come back. Everyone is on basically an expiring contract. And there's just, I'm sure that drives a lot of people kind of nuts in the personnel world. But you saw Dylan Stewart, for example, the defensive end from South Carolina, who was another name that we've kind of talked about as someone who had been on Ohio State's wish list. There was a big post on social media a few days ago that, he's coming back to South Carolina for $1.5 million. And it's like, okay, well, he got a new 1 year deal, but that's kind of the new reality of college football where, yeah, you've got them now. That doesn't mean they're back next year, no matter who they are or what year they are.
And that's why you have to keep saying, presumably Caleb Downs will be back. Not that we're saying he's going anywhere, but anybody can leave. And so you can't assume everybody's coming back, whether you'd like to have them or not. So you also have to operate that way, not just on podcasts, Tom, but putting a team together as well.
Not just on podcasts, but also in less important places, such as inside major college football facilities. So that's a name to know, certainly for Buckeye fans, something to watch. Dillon Thieneman has a visit coming up in the next week or so. Probably something, if the list stays at 2 schools, you would assume the decision would come down relatively quickly after that. But we'll be following that. We're going to have many more shows looking at some other areas of interest. Tony, my understanding is that there's some interest in Ohio State adding a couple players on the offensive line. So we'll have a show coming up about that as well. Lots to talk about all this week at BuckeyeHuddle.com as we talk about the transfer portal, talk a little bit about recruiting, oh yes, by the way, Ohio State has a college football playoff game coming up at Ohio Stadium next Saturday, December 21st at 8 p.m. We'll be there for that. We'll have full coverage of all of that at BuckeyeHuddle.com and, of course, at YouTube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.